Paul, can you explain some of the links between, or the perceived links between the Taliban and al-Qaeda?
Certainly. That's a very important question, given that the whole rationale and original purpose for Operation Enduring Freedom, our military intervention in Afghanistan, was counterterrorism. That intervention, begun 9 years ago, was initially, in my judgment, I'm not speaking for everyone else in the group, a just and proper response to the 9/11 attack, aimed directly at the perpetrators of that attack. And it was an expedition that in those initial weeks and months succeeded in rousting the al-Qaeda leadership from its then home away from home in Afghanistan and ousted its Taliban ally from power over what was basically 90% of Afghanistan. But since then, the mission has transformed into something larger. Something different, having to do with nation building in Afghanistan and a set of other objectives that we seem to have collected along the way. And the counterinsurgency itself has come to be treated as kind of an end in itself. We have lost sight of the specific counter-terrorist reasons why we are there. The situation back in 2001 and in the 3 or 4 years immediately before 9/11 was one in which the Afghan Taliban and al-Qaeda, or al-Qaeda Central as we sometimes call it today, given the further evolution of the jihadi movement, were allies. The Taliban had essentially been in power in Afghanistan as of 1994 when it brought more or less an end to the squabbling among the various Mujahideen factions that had fought the Soviets. It took power over most of Afghanistan. And it was 2 years later that bin Laden came back from Sudan to return to Afghanistan, where he first made a name for himself. So there very definitely was an alliance between those two elements then, as the Afghan civil war continued between the Taliban and the Northern Alliance, which was holding out in that remaining 10% of the land in the north. And it wasn't just a patron-client relationship. It really was two-way assistance in which bin Laden, given his financial and other resources, was assisting the Afghan Taliban in its prosecution of the civil war against the Northern Alliance, in return for which the Taliban served as a host for al-Qaeda. Today the situation is far different. Those were special circumstances back in the late 90s and into 2001 that don't exist anymore. As our own military and civilian leaders have told us, al-Qaeda is barely in Afghanistan at all. We've heard numbers from people like Mike Leiter of the National Counterterrorism Center and others where it seems to be only no more than 100 or so. General Jones gave us an estimate some time back as well. The leadership in the person of bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri evidently has been, ever since those first months in 2001, or first weeks of the expedition, on the other side of the Durand Line in northwest Pakistan. The Afghan Taliban, which has now become our principal enemy in this counterinsurgency, is not a transnational terrorist group. They are radical Islamists, to be sure. They do not share an interest in bin Laden's goals of transnational terrorism, of establishing a caliphate farther to the west, of overthrowing Middle Eastern governments. All the Afghan Taliban cares about is the political and social order in Afghanistan. They care about what we do only insofar as we are interfering in the political and social order in Afghanistan. The specter, of course, that is still out there in discussion and debate about this is, well, if we don't defeat the Afghan Taliban, then we're going to see a new safe haven established or reestablished by al-Qaeda, and this will mean increased danger for the American people. That is a false presumption on several counts. I already mentioned the primary one. Our main enemy, the Afghan Taliban, is not itself a transnational terrorist group. It does not have any apparent interest, I cannot see an interest either, at part of Mullah Omar or the Quetta Shura or the Afghan Taliban in having bin Laden and al-Qaeda reestablish anything like the presence they had in Afghanistan before. Mainly because the biggest setback they ever suffered was a direct result of our response to an al-Qaeda operation. And from al-Qaeda's point of view, it is hard to see any advantage that they would achieve by moving from where they are now, in North Waziristan or wherever, back across the Durand line to Afghanistan. And that's mainly because not just we have boots on the ground right now, but even if we didn't have boots on the ground, the ground rules and our policies would be completely different from the way they were prior to 9/11, where we were treating the situation more or less with kid gloves. The situation when, even when President Clinton launched the cruise missile strikes against the Zalo-Kiwi camp in 1998 after our embassy was bombed in 1998, this was seen by a lot of people in this town as you know, wagging the dog, as overkill. If anything like, well, if bin Laden and al-Qaeda even began to try to reestablish anything like the presence they had in Afghanistan, the gloves would be completely off, and we would basically bomb the heck out of it through our use of air power and offshore power. The final very important point I want to make about that, which relates directly to what is the threat to the American people from transnational terrorism of this particular group, is that even if there were a reestablishment of some kind of haven in Afghanistan, it adds little or nothing to the threat that al-Qaeda already poses to us today, because they have other places from which to operate, be it Yemen or Somalia or elsewhere, and also because of all the tools and assets that a group like that has that can bring to bear in posing dangers to us. A physical piece of geography is actually one of the less important ones, and I would just refer you to everything you already know about the 9/11 operation itself, which was planned and prepared in places like Spain and Hamburg and flight schools here in the United States. And the Afghan connection was almost incidental.